Anyway, the one that I've chosen, and it's one I've read more recently, is called Extreme Ownership. Extreme Ownership by Leif Babin and Jocko Willink.
Brilliant. Okay, talk to me about extreme ownership. What's the premise of the book?
Um, I mean, it is what it says on the tin in that it's talking about the power of ownership. Leif Babin and Jocko Willink are ex-Navy SEALs. And so they're basically, after coming out of the army and spending, many, many tours in Afghanistan and places like that, they looked at all the lessons they'd learned and decided, hey, we could teach some non-military, some civvies, these principles because they actually cross over. And so now they travel around all these corporations in America and talk to these CEOs and, really help with leadership. And then obviously someone said, you should write a book. And so they put it into a book. And well, number one, it's very sobering, right? Because extreme ownership by its nature just forces you to point all of the fingers back at yourself, all of the fingers back at yourself. And so all the excuses, all the reasoning, all the blame, all the whatever come back on you. So it's very sobering. Number two, it was just really simple. When you just need something profound, because some of the other books that I've read, especially on human behavior, they're like, okay, I'm running down the street because I'm listening to it while I'm running. I'm like, right, stop, pause, rewind. What? Like, say that again, Jordan Peterson or whatever. You know what I'm saying? It's like, this is crazy. But these guys, it's like simple, but really profound and super easy to like cross over. So, and it's them reading it. On audiobooks, it's not always the author that reads it, right? But it's them guys, and they sound like Navy SEALs. And it's like, we were in Ramadi in Iraq, as they say it. And, we were penned down by enemy fire. And they just tell these like incredible stories. And then so each point starts with a war story, then is flipped over to a business story, as in like, oh, I applied this principle to such and such a company when I met their CEO, and then they do that. And then it's kind of finished with like, questions about how it might apply to you in your context. And it's really good because I find myself in meetings. I don't know about you, but I'm in meetings from the minute I wake up to the minute I go to bed, it feels like sometimes. And I find myself in meetings like about to say something and then just going, extreme ownership would not say that. And I have to sort of stop myself. And that's the first application. And then unfortunately for the team around me, I've now started saying to them, nah, you can't, that's not going to help us. You got to own this, mate. You got to, and it's not just, and it's called extreme ownership because it is extreme. Because, there's lots of complex moving parts in any organization, isn't there? And the church included. And, you can't just shoulder it all. But yeah, I would fully recommend both reading it, getting your team to read it, and then talking about how you as a team can actually work that out. And I haven't told the team to read it, but the plan is that we're all going to read it next term, and that will be our focus.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's brilliant.
I'd love to dive into those kind of things that you said. There's things where you think, oh, I won't say that because of what you've learned through the book. What are some of those things? I think to kind of bring that out, I think would be really helpful.
Well, I think we have a blame culture in society, and we can, not from a wicked kind of evil heart, but with every good intention, we can basically throw other people under the bus or try to highlight in the area of a problem area how it wasn't you, which has got some validity probably because you need to get to the bottom of what went wrong or why it didn't work or why it wasn't as good as it could be. But actually, from a personal perspective, I'm only in charge of how I operate. So even if, let's say that, we have this endeavor, we try it and it fails, and it actually isn't my fault. It's actually one of my, like the way that they call it in the book is your subordinates. I don't know if we're happy with that term in church leadership. It feels a bit like, well, militant because
Yeah.
it's from the military. But like, let's say a team member, really, they drop the ball. It's like I'd have been in a meeting where I'd have said, you know, well, you didn't do this. But extreme ownership says, you don't say that. You say, hey, I'm really sorry because I didn't lead you in a way that enabled you to do X, Y, and Z. And I've got to take my responsibility for that. And the principle works if everybody does it, because then the person who hears that doesn't go, yeah, it was your fault. You didn't help me enough. They go, okay, I hear you and I appreciate what you're saying, but let me just own my section of it. So it kind of only works, which is why it's problematic that the team haven't read it yet. It's kind of only works if everybody agrees to it. Like, we're going to be an extreme ownership organization. And it's a way of talking as well as a way of thinking. Like, you didn't do this changes to, hey, I didn't help you do this.
Yeah, I think there's something that even at the, you know, like you said, you've read it and maybe you know your team haven't read it, but even at that base level of you just going, do you know what, I'm not shifting blame, that it models something that I think is really quite quite refreshing and healthy. And even if they haven't read it, hopefully then there's something that gets passed on to go, hang on a minute, maybe that's a to own your own, you know, your own part of it, even if it wasn't your fault at all, to
Yeah.
own the bit that, you know, because especially if you're leading people, you're like you said, you're accountable for it, even if you weren't responsible.
Yeah.
So I think that extreme ownership seems yeah, really, really important. And that's something that I think everyone probably could learn from.
Yeah. I mean, it's the difference between blame and responsibility, or fault and responsibility. You know, good leaders recognize that if something's not your fault, it doesn't mean it's not your responsibility.
Hmm.
And we're obsessed with blame, aren't we? You know, where there's a blame, there's a claim. That's the culture. And so we can quickly do that. Whereas I think leaders serve others better by going, okay, this wasn't my fault, but how can I take responsibility for what happened in some way to ensure that together it doesn't happen again, that kind of thing. It does sound like a little bit of a negative, like, outlook, but you know, organizations are complex, aren't they? And they've got moving parts and human hearts in the mix, which just makes everything more complicated, which why the human behavior category for the next book is so important to me, because we're not just an organization, we're not a machine. We've got those pesky things called human beings in the mix that make everything harder and better.